reviewing the introduction to housing counseling, and we'll be starting with section 2.1. If you're following along in your manual, this will be starting on page 18. So let's start by reviewing some of the roles in the world of housing counseling as it relates to pre-purchase homebuyer counseling. You'll certainly be working with clients. You'll also be working directly with lenders, probably more directly with lenders than in other types of housing counseling that you've done, because in pre-purchase counseling, it's very important to build those relationships with lenders, because that's how you're going to stay up to date on what's happening in the industry and on any program changes or new programs that become available. As a nonprofit agency, you'll also be working with other nonprofit agencies. It's important to build that referral network so you know what other agencies may be out there that can assist your clients. And the same would go with other agencies that might be available in the community or other resources that you may have in your community, whether that's job searching or help with a resume or just knowing what banks may be available. So this would be important to build your referral service for clients as well. You'll also be working with HUD and your funders because it is important to try and pay for this type of counseling. In the world of pre-purchase homebuyer counseling, there are a lot of potential funders for your programs. So we'll be talking about that in this unit. So let's start with just reviewing our role as housing counselors. And a quick, easy way to remember this is through the acronym RECAP, R-E-C-A-P. So let's go ahead and break that down. So our job as housing counselors, one of our jobs, is to do the R, which is to review all documentation collected from the client. And I do know sometimes we can get a little too consumed with the paperwork requirements, but it is our job to make sure that we're reviewing and documenting every step of the way for our clients. The E stands for examining and identifying barriers to homeownership. It's really important for our clients to be able to see that they have some challenges to overcome and to give them some advice on overcoming those barriers. And so that leads into the C, which is to create a work plan. This is also known as an action plan or a plan of action with the client. So we're helping them to understand here are the challenges that you're facing, and then we're going to create a plan on how you may overcome these challenges. The A stands for our job in assessing preparedness for the home purchase. Sometimes clients have perhaps unrealistic expectations or unrealistic assumptions about when they may be ready to purchase a home. So it's really our job to help assess when they may be ready to make that home purchase. And the P is to help our clients prepare for the responsibility of being home buyers. As a renter, if they've never had a homeowner, if they've never had home ownership responsibilities before, it can be a really big change. So as we go through this unit 2, we'll be talking about that. So you can see here that this is just kind of a quick acronym to remember some of our responsibilities when we're working with clients. Now let's talk first about different levels of client interaction. So the first level would be just doing that initial one-on-one session. This could be one appointment, it could be multiple appointments. But the initial session, if it works the way it should, would be a time to gather all the necessary information to help go through the next steps. And if you remember, the previous steps that we talked about would be reviewing the documentation, figuring out and helping the client identify the barriers that they're going to be facing, helping them to create a work plan. And I do always like to say helping them to create a work plan, because while we are going to help craft it and put it into words for them, they definitely want to buy into that action plan and make sure that they've had some participation there. During that appointment, we're also going to be assessing their preparedness and trying to give them some sort of a timeline as to when they may be ready to purchase a home. Okay, so during that initial appointment, we're really covering the R, the E, the C, and the A. And that's why I say it could take multiple appointments, or if you've got a client who's really brought everything in, you may have somebody who you can go through all of those in just that first one-on-one session. Now the second level is going to be when you're working with that client to accomplish all those action items. And so this is going to be doing all the follow-up work. And again, there's a wide variation here. You may have one follow-up appointment. You may have many. We do have some clients who really seem to require a lot of prompting, and you may have to have multiple follow-up sessions with those clients. You'll also notice that at this stage, you may even suspend a file. You may even close that file out. If you've got a client who is not doing their responsibilities on the action plan, or if you've got a client who withdraws, we're going to talk with you and explain to you how you can terminate a file or suspend a file if you've got a client where that's warranted. Now the final stage would be a client who's actually ready to go ahead and purchase a home. They're ready to get a mortgage. You've worked with them on overcoming their barriers. They're ready to go. And so that's going to be a completely different type of appointment because you're going to be working with them on not only the specifics of purchasing a home, but also the follow-up responsibilities when you become a homeowner. So that's when you get into, as I showed you on that previous slide, preparing them for the responsibilities of being homeowners. In section 2.2, we talk about the importance of building relationships with your clients. So let's go ahead and go over that. So a couple of key factors here when you're working on building those relationships would be always be sure that you greet that client and introduce yourself. I know sometimes we do get caught up and we're busy, but just remember they're probably nervous coming into that first appointment. So just introduce yourself. You might even give them an idea of your background to, make them comfortable. But greeting them and welcoming them into your office and introducing yourself and explaining your role is going to definitely improve their comfort level. This is also the time when you're going to be explaining services that you provide, and you might even go over other programs that are available at your agency. You want to make sure that they know they're not obligated to participate in those other programs, but letting them know what services are provided at the agency as a whole is going to help them see some of the value there. This is also a time to explain the limitations. You are going to make sure that you explain to them they're going to have some responsibilities too. So I like to call this part of it I would like to go over my responsibilities and your responsibilities part of it. And that's where you get into the limitations, and setting clear expectations with a client is really important at this stage. At this point, fees do have to be disclosed, and you want to be sure that you're explaining fees for any pre-purchase counseling that you do, even fees for things like credit reports. You want to be sure that those are disclosed. And most agencies will provide a written disclosure so that you've got some documentation in the file that you have disclosed those fees to the client. It's important at this stage to set some boundaries. You want to let the clients know when you're available and when you're not available. It's important for their expectation level that they know if they leave you a message, it may take you 24 hours to return it because you're working with other files as well. If you have, for instance, open office hours on a Friday, let them know that. You might want to let them know if appointments are always required. And I do recommend that appointments are always required because otherwise you're going to be in a constant cycle of dealing with walk-in clients. So let them know your office hours, let them know your policy on returning phone calls or email messages. If it's going to take you 24 hours, be sure and let them know that so you're not getting repeated calls because they don't understand why they haven't received a call back. It's going to be important to know that whatever documentation they provide to you, they should always keep a copy of it. And you can make copies during the appointment, But of course it's going to be better if they can come in and provide you with the copies. You don't ever want to keep original documents for a client. And these are important in the beginning of the counseling process, but it's really important, I think, throughout the counseling process. And sometimes I even like to go back and review some of these basics. If you have a client you're working with over a long period of time, you tend to get very, kind of friendly and comfortable, and they might forget that, you're only available for appointments on such and such day or at particular times. So sometimes you even have to review some of the boundaries if you think that that would be necessary or helpful throughout the counseling process. In building the relationships, a couple of tips here. Make sure your office is comfortable. They're going to be spending potentially a lot of time in that setting. It is required by HUD that you have a private place to meet with clients. It's important that they feel comfortable and that they have a level of privacy. So not only is that a HUD requirement, but I think you'll find that as far as building a relationship with clients where they do feel comfortable, you're going to want that level of privacy as well. A couple other things to note here. Make sure that your office is clear of any other client files. You certainly don't want them to feel like their material might be left out for someone else to see. So just make sure that they know you do respect their privacy and you've got a welcoming environment that is also private. Be aware of the community in which you're working and dress appropriately. A couple tips here might be that if you're working with a very conservative, in some cultures, it might be appropriate for women to wear dresses or not to wear pants. So just kind of be aware of the community that you're working with and dress appropriately related to them. You do have to be conscious of differences in language and cultural differences, and try and build an awareness. If that's not your culture, try and get some information so you know how you can establish that relationship with your clients and be sensitive to those issues. We're going to talk about some best communication practices, and I'm sure many of you, if you're already doing housing counseling, this is probably something that you're already very good at doing with your clients. So we're just going to go over a couple tips and things here that you want to perhaps focus on and make sure that if you're already doing it, that you continue doing it. So just remember that every single time you communicate with a client, each time you're going to be building on that trust. And I always like to say you could also be decreasing that trust. As you can see, the next bullet point here is that a lack of communication, you're going to lose that client's trust. So if they have to call and leave you multiple messages before you call them back, and I mean, over a period of time. If they know it takes you 24 hours, but you're consistently taking 2 or 3 days to return their call, that doesn't do very well for increasing the level of trust because you gave them that expectation and now you're not meeting it. So I think the biggest problem here is just that lack of communication. If clients feel like they're not getting a call back or a message back, it can definitely eat away at the trust that has been established. You do want to keep the client informed so that way they feel like they know kind of what progress they are making. And again, just a reminder here to make sure that they're getting copies of everything, or that you're only keeping copies, not any originals, and that they've got full documentation on their end, because that is important. So speaking of documentation, let's go ahead and cover the next 2 sections, which would be reviewing the documentation that you collect from the client, and we're going to do a section on avoiding conflicts of interest. Unfortunately, this is something as housing counselors we do have to be aware of. So our first section here, we're going to be going over collecting intake information. Now this can be done in several different settings. Frequently it's done by mail. So a client might call in to schedule an appointment and you mail them an intake application or a questionnaire that they need to fill out. So that might be something that you send out by mail. It could be something that's presented as a handout. Some agencies do group orientation sessions or they might do some education workshops. And during that session or that workshop, they might be explaining that one of the services available at your agency would be the pre-purchase homebuyer counseling. And so you might have a handout that also includes the intake information form. And this would be where you're collecting the basics, client name, address, demographic information. So your agency will have to develop their specific form that they use. A lot of agencies are now doing this electronically. They might have a link available on their website where the client can just click on it, fill it out, and do an electronic signature. They may have a way that they can just request it to be emailed to them, and then they either sign it and mail it back. You know, clients are really becoming more and more tech savvy. They may be able to sign it, scan it, and email it back. So electronically is also fine. Some agencies do still collect a lot of information over the phone. This is always harder because the client may or may not be prepared with all the information, and you've got the risk that you're going to get something wrong if someone else is typing it up and documenting it. So this would probably be the least preferable way of doing it. Now, the first choice would be that you try and get all this intake information before you even have that first counseling appointment, because that way you can make sure that you've got the information you're going to need for HUD reporting, and also you make sure that you can prepare for the appropriate type of appointment. And so it's important to try and get it, if you can, prior to that initial counseling appointment. Certainly some clients are going to show up and bring it with them, but if you can just build the expectation that you prefer to have it ahead of time, that would be the best standard. Because you're always going to have to document this information in whatever case management system you're using. If you're using HCO, you're going to have to document it. If you're using Counselor Max, you're going to have to document it. Or even if you're using a private system. So whatever client management system you're using, you're going to have to be sure you have this intake information recorded. So that's why it's preferable to have it prior to that first appointment, because otherwise they may show up without it. And sometimes you're tempted to go ahead and do a lot of work and you haven't even gotten all your proper documentation at that time. So most agencies will try and have a requirement that it has to be provided in advance. The things that you want to be sure you document from your client and that you're collecting from them, you're going to want to be sure you have that intake application. You're going to want to have a client authorization form. And this could be in a couple different types of settings. The client authorization may allow you to interact with other third parties. So maybe this allows you to call on their behalf and take some action. So just a general client authorization form is helpful to have in the file so you can use it if necessary. If you'll be pulling a credit report, and it's very likely that you will, you're going to want an authorization to pull that credit report. So it can be helpful to just go ahead and have that done during the initial intake appointment, because that would certainly be a problematic thing if you didn't have it on record. Another piece of documentation is going to be income documentation. So that could be pay stubs, W-2s, tax returns. In a future unit, we're going to be going over all the income documentation that you should be collecting from your clients. And again, I emphasize copies. For instance, you would never want their original tax returns here. Copies, copies, copies. That's all you ever want to have in your file. And by the way, these don't have to be pure paper files. You can scan these documents and save them in an electronic version. A lot of agencies have gone paperless, and that's fine. So however you've got this documentation in the file is certainly acceptable. You're going to want to be going over bank statements. So keep a copy of those bank statements so that you've got a record of the progress that they've made. If they're bringing in account statements, maybe credit card statements or utility bills, any type of account statements, you're going to want to keep those in the file as well. Most agencies do require verification of identity, so a copy of their ID. Now this is not a HUD requirement, but I know many of the agencies that I've worked with do require this as well to be in the client. I mean, they're going to have to provide it during the actual mortgage application, so sometimes it's helpful to go ahead and get it in the file at this point. I'd like to go ahead and take a little bit of time just to go over some of the common conflicts of interest that we run into and some of the tips on avoiding a problem in this area. So first, let's talk about what are some of the common areas where we see a conflict of interest, and what do we mean when we say conflict of interest? Well, a conflict of interest would occur if you've got a financial relationship with any of these roles listed: a mortgage company, a mortgage broker, a real estate agent, someone who's selling a house. If you've got any type of a financial relationship, you're paying them or they're paying you, this is clearly a red flag. So any type of a financial relationship between these outside parties would be a problem. Sometimes you have a conflict of interest because you've got a board member who could stand to gain by having a professional relationship between the counseling agency and their firm. For instance, if you've got a board member who also owns an appraisal service and all your business goes to that appraisal service, you've got a problem because that board member is financially benefiting from their relationship with your agency. Now, there are some times when you have a board member who may, for instance, also be a real estate agent. In that case, if there's the potential there for conflict, you just want to be sure that you've got clear documentation and clear boundaries that are drawn so that you've never got any questions about, is that board member, are they just serving on the board for financial gain? So just make sure that if there's the potential there, that you've documented how you're going to handle that. Also, there could be a conflict of interest if there's a personal relationship between the counselor and any provider of products, or even the client. If you've got a friend coming in or a family member coming in, probably best if they see another counselor. But here what we're really talking about is, for instance, a counselor who perhaps their brother runs an inspection service. And you would want to, of course, steer clear of referring your clients to that particular person to get their inspections done, because now there's, again, that financial relationship where you may have a problem. It could also be a conflict of interest if there's a relationship between any other organizational entities that are providing services to the client. So, this sometimes can be a common problem area if you have a real estate agent who always refers to the same inspectors and appraisers, the same mortgage bankers or brokers. So you just want to also be careful of those outside agencies that you're using to make sure that they don't have any conflict of interest with servicers that they're using as well. So just some things and some common areas where you may see some troubles. So how do you avoid a conflict of interest? Well, the first thing is full disclosure. Make sure you're very transparent about how your agency is funded and how you're paid for your transactions and how you pay for your programs. Most agencies have a service statement that they provide to all clients, whether they're coming in for pre-purchase homebuyer counseling or any other type of services. So that way the clients know that you get your funding from HUD, that you get your funding from, various mortgage institutions. So make sure that everything's properly disclosed as far as your funding sources. It's also important to make sure that you let clients know about your fee structure. When I talked about documentation and establishing that open communication with a client, I said during that first appointment, you greet them, you introduce yourself, you explain the services, and right up front, it's required that you disclose if there's going to be any fee requirements, and you want to be sure that you document that in the file as well, just to avoid any potential conflict of interest, or if a client says, I was never told that there would be this fee, that way you've got it in writing and you've disclosed your fee structure. You might also want to disclose your fee structure if you also provide other services at a fee. So most agencies have just developed kind of a comprehensive disclosure that lists all of their fee for services. It's also important to openly disclose, and it should be available on your website, the list of board members and any affiliations. So that way, again, you've got pure transparency there. You don't want someone to find out later that, they weren't aware of a particular board member. So having that open and available should certainly be something that you welcome. And again, most agencies have that through their website, or it may be part of their initial disclosure packet. I think the last bullet point is probably the most important, because there's the potential here for a lot of problems, big conflicts of interest. You always want to keep your client information confidential. And again, I'm sure those of you that are already in the counseling industry are well aware of this. But if you're new to the counseling industry, you might not realize that, you can't give the banker a list of your clients. If your friend or relative or even a referral is a real estate agent, you're not allowed to share with them any potential leads. So HUD really is very careful about protecting client privacy and confidentiality. So under no circumstances would you ever share any client information with any of your partners. So this will conclude this section. Just remember that it's important to be sure that you document everything in a client file. Be careful of potential conflicts of interest, and be sure that all the staff is educated in this area, because potentially any staff member could be subject to a conflict of interest.